All right. Well, welcome back to Family Friday webinar series. My name is Sherry Obrentz. I'm an Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. So happy to have you all here today to learn more about our accessibility services. Before we get started, just a reminder, if this is your first time joining us, welcome. If this is not your first webinar with us, welcome back. And if you want to review any of the topics that we've discussed earlier this summer, you can rewatch our webinars or see all the materials that go with it on our Family Friday webpage, and the URL is listed there as well. Today, we have two great panelists from our Office of Accessibility Services, Ethan MAGNES and Sarah Marchetti. And they're going to take you through the ins and outs of what you need to know for students who can get registered for or registered with the Office of Accessibility Services, but also what accommodations are, what they look like. And I will interject a little bit. So I, coming from the college, have worked with many students over the last 17 years who have accommodations. And we see how this kind of plays out in the classroom. We know this is also a big topic of transition. For many parents and families, you have been the driver of accommodations for your students throughout their elementary and high school educations. And that really changes in college when they become the drivers. And in some cases, your students have been their own best advocates, and that's wonderful. But these two experts will kind of walk you through the ins and outs. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ethan to do a quick introduction and then get started.
Hello all, welcome. I am Ethan MAGNES, the Accommodation Specialist for third and fourth year students and graduate students. Also in the presentation, you'll be hearing from my colleague, Sarah Marchetti, and she is the other Accommodation Specialist in the Department of Accessibility Services, and she serves first and second year students and students at Oxford. So the two of us are a team. We see, all of the requests come in, accommodations transitioning from high school into the college setting. So we're gonna walk you through what our office looks like today. So basically a general synopsis of what our office does. Our office, our goal is to provide accommodations that reduce or remove as many barriers as possible that limit students' abilities or students with disabilities and their ability to participate and succeed in post-secondary education. On this slide, I want to just point out our website, accessibility@emory.edu. Our website it can walk you through exactly what the process looks like, the contacts, and a lot of good stuff is on our website. So as we go through the presentation today, me and Sarah will kind of reference our website. If you haven't visited our website and your student may be getting accommodations or you're thinking about it for your student, I highly recommend visiting our website. So this is kind of the, Cliff Notes version of accommodation request process. Students must reach out to DAS to initiate the registration process. And then we collect documentation from the student. And if eligible under the ADA, we will then have an intake meeting with your student that goes over the accommodation plan and what accommodations will look like here at Emory for your student's career. Now, this is a super important slide for me and Sarah. We kind of recommend maybe even taking a photo of it with your phone, screenshot, whatever, just so you kind of know what the registration process looks like and what it will entail over the summer, because, that transition from June, July out of high school right into August here at Emory is going to be a quick transition. So the process looks a little bit like this. Your student will go to our website and complete the student registration form. One thing that we see a lot is just make sure that your student is using their Emory email to do that registration form and checks their Emory email, because once they get into Emory and now that they're an Emory student, everything through our office goes through their Emory email. As they complete step one, step two is to submit documentation. There is a way where you can submit your documentation along with step one. However, sometimes we realize, parents and students are still collecting documentation. They're still running down the psychologist, the doctor, the primary care personnel, the high school that they went to get some of that paperwork in order. However, the earlier, the better with the documentation. So step one and step two are the meat of what needs to be turned into our office first. So then we can move to step 3 and get your student's accommodation plan in place. So for this year, for fall 2022, we will begin reviewing accommodation requests and officially starting to schedule our intake meetings and finalizing plans around July 15th to get ready to roll in late August for the start of the semester. Once your student has completed step 1 and step 2, on step 3 with the review, a lot of the time they will just be approved by us, and me and Sarah will schedule intake meetings and go over your student's finalized accommodation plan. However, sometimes with letter B and letter C, with B, sometimes we need more information needed. We need clarification from your student exactly what they're requesting, or there might be questions about the documentation or lack of clarity, or something that we might need more of before we can finalize our accommodation plan. So once again, me and Sarah in our office in general highly recommends that your student gets in the habit of checking their Emory email in case me or Sarah need more information to finalize your student's plan. And letter C doesn't happen too much, but sometimes, we do not approve an accommodation, and that will be communicated by us. For the parents, you don't really see it this way, but one thing we see with the students is sometimes, somebody might want a single room with dyslexia, and that's just something we can't just approve everybody with dyslexia for a single room, because single rooms are the hot topic amongst the incoming freshman class. They all want a single room. We can't approve everyone. But for the most part, we approve your accommodations with the proper documentation. So step 3 begins July 15th, rolling all the way into the school year. However, we really want your students to complete steps 1 and 2 nice and early.
And Ethan, before you go on to the welcome sessions, you just mentioned housing. The housing requests for accommodations were actually due June 1st. And so we're already past that deadline. If for whatever reason you missed that deadline and you do believe your student believes that they need a housing accommodation, we are urging you to get those in this week. But that means that you have to go through steps 1, 2, and 3, or at least 1 and 2 for DAS to actually approve it through the housing office. So housing does not approve the accommodations, but they are working on the assignment. So just to highlight, if that is you and you are asking for that, it is not guaranteed, but it is past the deadline. So get that in ASAP.
Yes. And after step 3, we will begin doing, welcome sessions and getting students transitioned into getting their accommodation plans implemented in their academics and student life setting. And those sessions will start August 1st, going all the way into the beginning of the school year. So we highly recommend that, after July 15th, your students really in a habit of checking their student email, and also that the student registration form has been completed, documentation. I would start gathering that type of stuff now, just so that when me and Sarah begin reviewing registrations in mid-July, your student has all their paperwork and registration in order, because deadlines come quickly, and before we know it, the school year will start. So we highly recommend in DAS that your student begins the process nice and early. All right, with documentation, I know for a lot of folks, it's a transition from, a student being under 18 in high school, but now in college, they're an adult. And sometimes, different people have different copies of documentation, or the student might not know what documentation is available from their high school or from their parents or from their doctor. So one thing we like to reiterate with documentation is it must be, signed and dated by an appropriate professional. One thing we like to mention is, like primary care personnel, psychiatrist, psychologist is appropriate. Family members or like a teacher in high school isn't the same as a medical professional, just to kind of clarify that. And then we also, with documentation, we want to see the disability history and diagnosis and the timeline of that. I know sometimes there's some later in academic career diagnoses. However, it is helpful and important and imperative to us to see the disability history and the diagnosis in the documentation. And then another thing that's super important is have that medical provider or whoever it was who completed the paperwork on behalf of your student, describe the current impact of the student in the academic setting, in the housing setting, in the whatever setting your student may be needing accommodations. One thing for academic accommodations that's really, really helpful for me and Sarah, we love it when a student will turn this in as documentation. It makes our job very, very easy. Is an IEP 504 plan or summary of performance. Another thing that we also love is, if there's a psychoeducational evaluation for more of the learning disabilities, those are very, very, very good examples of something that would be supportive documentation, would be solid documentation to get your student to get the same accommodations, hopefully, or just accommodations that fit their needs. And just a general thing too, just making sure our documentation and paperwork that we submit to our office connects how whatever requested accommodations your student is making, in the documentation, the medical provider describes what are the functional limitations of the student and how those accommodations would connect with those functional limitations, which is usually pretty self-explanatory. And going into the next slide, actually, I want to kind of give you all some examples in case you're not sure what documentation your high school has, what documentation you have on file for your student already. Our website, like I said, I'm going to keep pushing our website, has some great forms that you can download and use. So for just looking at the list here, if there's a form that might fit your student's condition, whether it be ADHD verification form, communication or language disorder verification, I'm not going to read all of them, but however, just taking a glance, we have some forms available on our website in which we have, the charts, we have descriptions of the, specific questions for your medical provider that fit that form. So for the ADHD verification form, the form would be very easy for the medical provider to kind of fill out and describe how ADHD is impacting your student. So if you don't have a 504 plan, a psychoeducational evaluation, I highly recommend starting with these forms, just because you'll have that on file with our office once your doctor completes that and sends it to our office. However, if you have a lot from high school too, you might not need these. I just like to give this as a backup option so that there's plenty of forms available for you and your student to take to your medical provider. And I just kind of screenshotted and added in this slide what the web page, what on our website this page looks like. If you click on students and then you go to new to DAS and click forms, it's not super hard to find for your student. Hopefully your student can find it. There's blue live links that if you click on the DAS ADHD verification form or DAS verification of mental health disorder form, whichever form fits you and your student's needs, when you click on it, it will open it up and you can download it as a PDF, print it, send it to your medical provider. So we just want to make sure that you're aware that our website has a version of these forms where you can just click and you have access to it. So if you haven't visited our website yet, go ahead and explore our website and have your student explore the website. But this is a great place to find some of those forms and take them to your medical provider. So just kind of a general synopsis of what DAS and the students we serve, what conditions and conditions we see and conditions we're serving in our office. A large majority of the students we serve are somewhere with learning disabilities, psychological, psychiatric, ADHD, other chronic medical or mental health conditions are our highest. However, you see we do have a diverse spectrum on students we serve. We even have, if your student gets injured and has a traumatic brain injury in their time here at Emory, we also provide temporary accommodations. So we serve a wide range of students, and we look forward to being able to help your student in any way that they need.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you, Ethan. And as Ethan mentioned, I'm the other accommodation specialist in the DAS office, and I work with the first and second year students. And so now I'm going to kind of walk through some examples of academic accommodations. So I'm going to kind of connect the functional limitations and the documentation piece, like Ethan mentioned, with what the examples of actual approved academic accommodations might be. And so just to give a few examples here, let's say that a student's documentation indicates that they have issues with the ability to concentrate during tests or exams. So the academic accommodation that might be approved for something like that could be extra time to complete test exams or potentially testing in a distraction-reduced setting. Let's say a student struggles with the ability to meet assignment deadlines or can be overwhelmed with too much testing in one day, then potentially an academic accommodation could be no more than one test or exam scheduled per day. One functional limitation that we see fairly often is a struggle with the student's ability to listen and take class notes at the same time. And so that academic accommodation could be the use of a note taker for class notes. And at this point in time, we're kind of moving towards an audio note-taking software that we utilize called Glean. And we've received a lot of feedback from students about how helpful that is for them. So that might be one option. Let's say a student struggles with the ability to make class presentations. Potentially an academic accommodation there could be an assignment extension that would be negotiated in advance when possible. And sometimes students might have an inability to attend class during flares of a certain condition. Sometimes that could be predictable and sometimes it's unpredictable. So in those situations, we often recommend an academic accommodation for flexibility with attendance. And we recommend that students collaborate with their faculty and decide ahead of time at the beginning of the semester when their academic accommodations are put in place, how that's going to work. So if they can predict when they might be out, then maybe they'll send an email ahead of time, let the professors know. Otherwise, if they can't predict it, then maybe afterwards, a couple of days, they'll communicate with faculty and let them know what's been going on. All right, and so here are some other types of accommodations, a few more academic as well as some other ones. Let's say a student has a functional limitation of a treatment regimen that has side effects which impact them during specific times of the day. So if a student is taking medication which potentially makes them drowsy in the afternoons, and so they prefer to take classes in the morning when they're more alert, then that academic accommodation could be priority registration, so that way they can build their schedule around times of day that work best. Another functional limitation could be a student's ability to maintain a full-time course requirement. And so in that instance, potentially a reduced course load would be the academic accommodation there. Let's say a student might struggle with the ability to share a room due to needing additional medical equipment or needing to prescribe to a certain treatment regimen. In that case, they might need housing accommodations. Let's say a student has a functional limitation of inability to walk or access certain building entrances, then potentially that would be a paratransit service, which goes across the whole campus. Potentially that could also be a housing accommodation if a student needs to be on a certain floor or have access to an elevator, potentially a non-lofted bed. It really just depends. And then lastly, a student's ability to process reading or a delayed pace of reading. So potentially there, the accommodation could be alternative textbook formatting. It could be advanced notice of maybe large reading assignments. And the whole point of showing these examples is just to show, like Ethan said, the connection between the functional limitations that are listed on, evaluations or documentation and what the accommodations are that are requested. All right, so right here, these are some common missteps, some issues that students might run into when they're either registering or failing to register with our office. So delay of disclosure is a big one, and you'll see stigma and professor perspective kind of fall under that. So a lot of times when a student is transitioning to post-secondary, Ethan kind of mentioned that students are used to like IEPs being either more parent-led or teacher-led. And so here is that transition where the student really has to take over and they have to reach out themselves. And a lot of times, depending on what the student's needs are, a lot of students come to college and think they kind of want to try it on their own first, and see how it goes. And sometimes they'll come to our office maybe halfway through a semester, at the end of the semester during finals, when they've been struggling. And at that point, academic accommodations are not retroactive. And so that's why we always recommend registering as early as possible. And we recommend, having conversations with your students about, stigma and about the fact that, utilizing accommodations doesn't make, that's okay, that it's okay, because we're removing barriers. That's what's happening. All right. And then another common misstep could be related to temporary conditions. And we mentioned that because a lot of people don't know that we actually provide and approve accommodations for temporary conditions. So someone can come to their office if they have an injury or they had surgery. So let's say a student maybe, could have had a concussion while playing basketball, or they, broke a leg or anything like that. They can come to our office because they might need a temporary accommodation for using like the paratransit services on campus, or potentially they might need a temporary housing accommodation. And so we are available for that as well. And then, lastly, accommodations don't automatically equal success. So accommodations, like I mentioned, are to remove barriers to academic success and access, but a student still has to display, knowledge of a course. And so when it comes to certain things like if there's a flare in a condition, potentially a student may end up having to drop some classes, have a medical withdrawal, take a leave of absence. And so those are things that would happen outside of the DAS office, but we do recommend seeking accommodations when possible.
Sarah, I wanted to kind of reiterate some of the great points you made on this slide. So on the academic side of the house, as an academic dean who's dealt with advising and learning support over years, we cannot emphasize enough 2 points. One, that accommodations are not retroactive. And two, that it really takes time, as you can see from this office, for students to get registered and all the documentation in. So we are begging and pleading that you submit everything, that your student at least registers on the front end and is knowledgeable about what all those accommodations are. If they end up not using them, okay, but at least it's there, because it does take time for them to get set up in the system, to notify professors. And if they're doing that mid-semester, end of the semester, nothing is retroactive, even if you have that documentation. And I would also say that it really is a great opportunity, as we talked in weeks past about the transition of care, for students to step up and be their own advocates, learn about all their own documentation, be the ones who are filling out that registration form. I will tell you, I've spoken with many parents who say, well, I know I submitted all of that stuff on behalf of my student, and then the students don't actually take the next steps to get their accommodations. And so if you are, the holder of documentation or the one who wants to get this registration started, at least have your student with you so that they know that you're doing it. But really, ideally, your student is starting these steps on their own and maybe asking you for help if they run into any barriers to do that.
Yes, yeah, completely agree. And it is, can be an interactive process with us and the student. And so, yeah, we definitely recommend registering. And when a student is approved for accommodations as well, they will request a letter every semester, and they can choose which courses their accommodations are connected to as well. So a student does have, some control over which accommodations will show up on their letter and which courses they are connected with as well. All right, so parent to parent. So right here, this is just a little screenshot from a letter from Jane Jarrow. So she's really a leader in the field of disability in higher education. And so she penned an open letter to parents of students with disabilities about to enter college. And so not only is she a leader in this field, she's also a parent of a student with a disability herself. And so this is just one quick little screenshot of the letter. It's about 3 to 4 pages long. If you Google her name, Jane Jarrow, an open letter, it'll come up on multiple different websites. But we highly recommend reading this because I think parents find it useful because it shows both your unique perspective of having a child with a disability. There might be some different and unique, concerns or questions that you might have as related to parenting a student with a disability who's going off for the first time, as well as, talking about how you can support them and really support that student self-advocacy piece. And she has some specific recommendations about ways that you can support your student. And so we definitely recommend that you take a look at that letter. All right. And now we're talking about the transition of accommodations and what you can do now to prepare. So I think we've mentioned it as much as we can, but initiate that registration process as soon as possible. Again, like Ethan mentioned, start getting that documentation if you don't have it. If you're unsure about the documentation that you do have, it's a safe bet to just go ahead and have your provider or clinician complete one of those forms. That just moves things along. plan for that continuum of care. So this is really important. You know, if your student has weekly or monthly counseling sessions or doctor's appointments, how is that going to transition when they come to Emory? You know, if they're doing therapy sessions in person, are they going to be able to continue virtually with their clinician? Are they going to need to connect with someone on campus or someone in the metro area? So making those types of plans can just help with a smooth transition. And then again, support student advocacy. You know, we say it as much as possible, but you're just helping your student prepare for the conversations that they're going to have with faculty when they're here. And so if they're already kind of used to doing that, they'll just feel more comfortable when they're in that position. And then consult DAS with your student. So, you know, you could do an initial reach out with your student as needed, or maybe even help your student construct an email to DAS if they have a specific question, but really just supporting the student as they initiate the process on their own. All right. We wanted to put this slide in here just to make sure that everyone has access to some additional resources. So this is through the Office for Undergraduate Education. These are some student support services that are available to all undergraduates. So this is not specifically students that are registered with DAS. This is for all students, but this is just some extra services that, you know, students who are registered with us can benefit from as well. And so you'll see through the OUE office, there's some academic coaching. There's some peer and staff tutoring, learning assistance, skill building workshops and events. There's a writing center, and there's an academic success resources Canvas site. And so that's just a really great support services for students who might need a little extra help with maybe like study skills, just specific classes or anything like that.
Sarah, this is my favorite slide because this is my office, and actually when I started at Emory, this was my department. So I want to just harp on this. These resources are really quite amazing, and we've seen Emory students come a long way. Obviously, everyone is bright and motivated and expects to do well when they're here, but college is different than high school. And so all of these services are in place, and we know that students who utilize them feel more supported, feel more connected, and do better. It doesn't mean that you have to be struggling in a class to use them either. So academic coaching can help with that time management or managing assignments, especially students who are going from being in school, you know, 35 hours a day to only being in class, a week, 15 to 20 hours a week. Like it's a shift with that. The skill building workshops are really amazing. The specific class tutoring is really great, led by students who have actually been successful in the classes. So we talk about this in ECS 101, which is a class all first year students will take in the fall. And students go, yeah, maybe I'll use it, or I know it's there. And then they get that first midterm back. So we'd love to highlight some of these things early, again, to remove the stigma, to encourage exploration of these websites, to know what's out there. And if you get that phone call from a student in the middle of the night or after that first chemistry test, or when they maybe missed an assignment, a great part of being a parent and supporting them is redirecting them to these resources so that they can connect and do better as they move on. So thanks, Sarah, for including this slide.
Absolutely. And I think that about concludes our portion of the presentation.
Awesome. And Allison Butler, who's our director of DAS, has been answering questions in the chat. So thanks to everybody who submitted those. A few housekeeping issues. We are taking next Friday off, July 1st, for the 4th of July weekend. But we have some great Friday family webinars for the rest of July around academic advising and registration, housing, dining, and residence life, and then finding community and connection. So we hope to see you all in the next few weeks. Again, thank you so much to Ethan and Sarah and Allison for sharing all this great information about the Department of Accessibility Services. We hope you found it useful as well. Make sure you register, get all of that documentation in. We cannot emphasize that enough. And we look forward to seeing you in July. Have a great weekend.